The cabin in the pines. It was supposed to be the quietest week of our summer. My wife, Emily, had just returned from a long overseas deployment with the military. She had spent months sleeping on a cot in the desert heat, waking to the sound of distant rumbling and the ever-present tension that came with wearing her uniform. I had been planning a way for her to recharge, away from the noise of city life and the endless demands of work. That was why I decided it was time for her to spend a few weeks at my late grandfather's cabin, an old wooden retreat tucked deep in the pines. Perched on a ridge that overlooked a crystal-clear lake, the cabin had always been my sanctuary. I had spent countless summers there as a boy, learning to fish, stack firewood, and respect the stillness of the wilderness. Over the years, the property had been kept in good shape, but I had modernized it just enough to be comfortable without ruining its rustic charm. And the best part? It sat just outside the jurisdiction of the town's homeowners association, though you would never know it, given how often HOA members wandered over, acting as if they had some authority over it. The first few days after Emily arrived, I watched her shoulders loosen, her smile return, and the tension in her eyes fade as she settled into the rhythm of the cabin. She spent mornings sipping coffee on the porch while the mist drifted lazily off the lake, afternoons reading by the crackling fireplace, and evenings watching the stars spill across the sky in a way no city ever could match. It was exactly what she needed. But in our little corner of the woods, peace had an expiration date, and it often came in the form of one woman. Her name was Karen. She was the self-appointed enforcer of the nearby HOA, a woman whose hobbies included peering through binoculars at neighbors' properties and sending passive-aggressive letters citing imaginary infractions. For years, she had complained about the cabin, claiming it was within the HOA visual boundary and therefore subject to their rules. I had always ignored her, politely explaining that my land was privately owned, purchased decades before the HOA was even formed. But Karen did not like being told she had no power over someone. On the fourth afternoon of Emily's stay, I was running errands in town when my phone buzzed with a series of missed calls from her. Before I could call back, a text came through. "You won't believe this. HOA lady just showed up with 2 police officers." My heart sank. I knew exactly who HOA lady was. According to Emily, it started with a knock that was not just loud, it was authoritative, the kind of knock meant to intimidate. When she opened the door, Karen was standing there in her oversized sunglasses, arms crossed, wearing the kind of smug smile that told you she had already decided she was in the right. Beside her stood 2 uniformed officers, both looking a little confused as they glanced at the neatly kept porch and the flower pots Emily had arranged. Karen wasted no time. "This property is not supposed to be occupied without HOA approval," she declared, her tone dripping with self-importance. "We've had reports of an unauthorized person staying here, and I am exercising my right to involve law enforcement." Emily, still in her comfortable jeans and sweatshirt, blinked in disbelief. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she replied calmly. "This is my husband's cabin. He owns it outright. No HOA rules apply here." But Karen was not there for a discussion, she was there for a scene. She kept pushing, claiming Emily might be squatting or trespassing, suggesting that perhaps I had rented the cabin illegally. The officers, bound to respond to the call, asked for identification. And that was when everything changed. Emily reached into her bag, pulled out her military ID, and placed it firmly in the officer's hand. "I just got back from serving overseas," she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight of authority. "This cabin belongs to my family. I have every right to be here." The officer's eyes shifted immediately. His posture straightened, and he handed the ID back with respect. "Ma'am, that's all I needed to see," he said. "You're fine here." Karen, on the other hand, looked as though the ground had just been pulled out from under her. The smugness drained from her face, replaced with a flicker of uncertainty she could not quite hide. She opened her mouth to argue, but for once, no words came out. What Karen did not know was that this was just the beginning. By the time the week was over, she would wish she had never set foot on my property. Returning to the cabin, by the time I pulled off the winding forest road and approached the cabin, the sun was slipping behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the porch. Emily was sitting in one of the old rocking chairs, her arms folded, a quiet fire in her eyes. I could tell from her posture that she was calm on the surface, but underneath, she was still replaying the encounter with Karen and the police. Emily had faced far worse overseas. She had been through the kind of challenges that test a person's endurance and patience, but there was something uniquely infuriating about coming home and being treated like she was an intruder on her own property. She wasted no time filling me in on every detail. Karen had arrived strutting like she owned the place, her sunglasses perched high on her head like a crown, and her clipboard clutched under one arm as if it were a badge of authority. She had spoken over Emily repeatedly, directing her statements to the officers as though Emily's voice was irrelevant. It wasn't until the military ID came out that the air shifted, the confidence draining from Karen's face like water through sand. The officers, respectful and efficient, had given Emily a polite nod before leaving without further comment. But Karen hadn't left right away. She had lingered on the gravel path for a full minute, staring at the cabin, her jaw tight, as if she were calculating her next move. I listened without interrupting, my mind already working. I had dealt with Karen before, but this was a bold escalation. She hadn't just complained or sent a letter, she had involved law enforcement. That crossed a line. The problem with people like Karen was that they thrived on intimidation and control, especially when they thought they could catch someone off guard. The key was never to meet them with the same energy they brought. Instead, you dismantled their power with facts, patience, and if necessary, public exposure. After Emily finished, I told her exactly what I planned to do. Step 1 was making it clear that our property was well outside HOA jurisdiction. Not probably or technically, but in a way that was documented and indisputable. I still had the original deed from my grandfather's purchase, along with a land survey that showed the cabin sat on a separate parcel, surrounded by privately owned woodland. The HOA had no legal authority over it, and the only way they could enforce anything was if we voluntarily submitted to their rules, which we never had and never would. That evening, as we sat on the porch sipping coffee, we saw headlights cutting through the trees. A white SUV slowed to a crawl on the dirt road in front of our driveway. Even before it stopped, I recognized it. It was Karen's vehicle. She didn't get out. Instead, she sat there for a moment, glaring at the cabin before pulling away without a word. Emily raised an eyebrow. "She's watching," she said quietly. I nodded. "Good. Let her watch." The next morning, I took a trip to the county records office. The clerk there was an older gentleman who had known my grandfather. When I explained the situation, he chuckled and said, "You're not the first person that HOA's tried to push around. They've been making up boundaries for years." He provided me with certified copies of the deed and property maps official documents that left no room for interpretation. I left the office with a folder under my arm and the certainty that we were about to make this very public. When I returned, Emily was outside, raking leaves near the porch. She had changed into one of my old flannel shirts and had that determined set to her jaw. "So, what's the plan?" she asked. I told her that the next time Karen showed up, and she would show up, we would meet her calmly, present the documents, and make it clear that any further harassment would be considered trespassing and reported directly to the sheriff. But I also had a second step in mind, attending the next HOA meeting as a guest. If Karen wanted to play games, we'd bring the truth directly into her own territory. That night, we prepared a neat packet of the documents, complete with highlighted sections showing the property boundaries. Emily also wrote a short statement about the incident, just in case we needed to file an official complaint. She did it with the precision and discipline I had always admired in her, a reflection of the same skills that made her so effective in her service career. Over the next couple of days, the air around the cabin seemed quieter, but there was a tension beneath it. We noticed Karen's SUV passing by twice a day, once in the morning and again in the late afternoon. Each time, she slowed just enough to make it obvious she was watching. She wasn't done not by a long shot. And while some people might have found that unnerving, Emily and I took it as confirmation. Karen was rattled. She had tried to assert control, and instead, she had been confronted with someone who refused to be intimidated. On the third morning after the police visit, we got our chance. A knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate. This time, when Emily opened it, Karen stood alone, no officers in sight, holding a manila envelope in her hands. Her smile was thin, her voice clipped. "I thought you should have a copy of the HOA's occupancy guidelines," she said, her tone implying this was a generous gesture rather than another attempt to assert power. Emily stepped aside, letting her in just far enough to see the folder of legal documents spread neatly across the table. Karen's eyes flicked to the papers, and for a moment, I saw the faintest crack in her confidence. "We have our own documents." "Two," I said evenly, sliding the deed across the table so she could see the county seal. "This property is not part of your HOA. It never has been. And if you step foot on this land again without a valid reason, it will be considered trespassing." For the first time since I'd known her, Karen didn't have a quick retort. She stood there, silent, the weight of the situation finally settling on her. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and left. The screen door creaked shut. Behind her, the sound echoing in the stillness of the cabin, Emily looked at me and smiled. "She'll be back," she said. I nodded slowly. "I know. And when she comes, we'll be ready." The HOA meeting showdown, the invitation to the upcoming HOA meeting, arrived not by accident, but through Karen herself. A week after our last confrontation at the cabin, we found a flyer tucked neatly under the windshield wiper of my truck while it was parked in town. In large bold letters, it announced, "HOA Community Meeting, Discussion on Unauthorized Occupancy and Property Compliance." The wording was vague enough to sound routine, but I knew exactly what it meant. This was Karen's way of pulling the matter into her territory, where she believed she had home advantage. She wanted an audience. She wanted backup. She wanted to make an example of us. What she did not realize was that we were more than prepared to walk straight into her chosen battleground with truth and proof that could dismantle her entire claim. When I showed the flyer to Emily, she did not hesitate. "We're going," she said. There was no trace of doubt in her voice, only the same kind of confidence she carried on deployment. "And we're not going just to defend ourselves. We're going to make sure no one else has to deal with this kind of harassment." From her again. On the evening of the meeting, the HOA clubhouse was buzzing with chatter. It was a bright, overly polished building with framed pictures of manicured lawns and smiling families lining the walls, a deliberate attempt to project harmony and order. But beneath that staged perfection, there was an undeniable air of tension. Residents milled around, greeting each other politely while casting curious glances at Emily and me as we walked in. Many recognized Emily from the incident word travels fast in a community like this. Karen was already at the front of the room, standing behind a long table with a stack of papers in front of her. She was dressed in a crisp blazer, her hair styled immaculately as if she were preparing for a press conference. When she spotted us, her lips curved into a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Oh, I'm so glad you could join us," she said loudly, ensuring that those nearby heard. The meeting began with the usual formalities: approval of the last meeting's minutes, a quick rundown of budget allocations, and a brief update on upcoming landscaping projects. But then Karen cleared her throat and announced the special discussion she had been so eager to hold. We've had reports of unauthorized occupancy in a property within visual boundary of our community. She began, her voice projecting a practiced authority. This creates safety concerns, as we must ensure all residents and guests are properly documented and in compliance with HOA regulations. A few people nodded, clearly accustomed to accepting her word without question. But others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the edge in her tone. That was when I stood up. Before this goes any further, I said evenly, I'd like to clarify something. My family's property is not within your HOA jurisdiction. It's never been part of your development. And we have certified documents from the county to prove it. The room quieted instantly. All eyes turned to me as I pulled out the folder we had prepared, laying the deed and property maps on the table for everyone to see. The county seal gleamed under the overhead lights, each page clearly marked with parcel numbers that matched our land. Emily stepped forward, her posture calm but commanding, and placed her military ID on top of the papers. When Karen called, "The police on me," I complied, showed my ID, and was cleared on the spot, she said. Yet here we are, being dragged into a meeting for a property this HOA has no legal claim over. A murmur swept through the room. One man in the back raised his hand. Wait, if the cabin isn't part of the HOA, why is this even on the agenda? Another resident, an older woman with sharp eyes, added, and why would you call the police over something you hadn't confirmed first? Her question was aimed squarely at Karen. Karen's composure faltered. She tried to maintain her usual tone, but the cracks were starting to show. I was acting in the community's best interest, she insisted. It's about safety and maintaining standards. Safety? I interrupted, keeping my voice steady. You called armed officers on a veteran sitting in her own home. You didn't knock to ask questions. You didn't check the property line records. You made assumptions, and you escalated them in a way that could have had serious consequences. The older woman nodded sharply. I've lived here for 15 years, and I'm tired of these so-called safety checks that turn out to be power plays, she said. Her words drew quiet agreement from several others in the room. From that moment, the meeting was no longer Karen's performance. It became an open forum. One by one, residents began voicing their own frustrations: fines for minor infractions, invasive inspections, letters about trivial matters like mailbox colors or flower bed arrangements. It became clear that Karen's authority had been largely unchallenged until now, and our confrontation had cracked open a door. People were eager to step through. By the end of the discussion, the HOA president, an older man who had been quietly observing from the far side of the table, spoke for the first time. It appears we've overstepped on this matter, he said carefully. The cabin in question is private property. We have no jurisdiction, and this will be struck from our agenda going forward. His words were final. And though he avoided looking directly at Karen, his tone carried a weight she could not ignore. When the meeting adjourned, several residents approached us to thank Emily for speaking up. A middle-aged man in a work shirt shook my hand firmly and said, "You did us all a favor tonight. She's been running this place unchecked for too long." Emily smiled, her eyes meeting mine with that unspoken understanding we had always shared. This fight had been bigger than just us. As we walked out into the cool night air, I glanced back to see Karen still standing near the table, her papers clutched tightly, her expression unreadable. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot, and as much as she might have been humiliated tonight, I knew she was already planning her next move. But so were we. Karen's counterattack the days following the HOA meeting were unusually quiet, almost suspiciously so. Emily and I had grown accustomed to spotting Karen's white SUV passing the cabin like clockwork, but now it was nowhere to be seen. At first, we wondered if she had finally accepted defeat, embarrassed enough by the public exposure at the meeting to step back. But people like Karen do not retreat, they regroup. And as it turned out, her silence was not surrender. It was strategy. The first sign came in the form of an official-looking envelope slipped under our cabin door early one morning. The envelope bore the seal of the county zoning and building department. Inside was a notice stating that complaints have been filed regarding potential code violations on our property. It listed vague allegations, unpermitted structures, possible environmental hazards, and questions about our septic system. Each item would require an inspection, the notice warned, and failure to comply could result in fines. The letter was cold and bureaucratic, the kind of thing designed to send a property owner into a panic. Emily read it twice before setting it down on the table. "This is Karen written all over it," she said flatly. "She couldn't get us through the HOA, so now she's trying to weaponize the county." I agreed. It was exactly the kind of tactic that fit her pattern. Find a loophole, twist it, and use it to harass. The problem for Karen was that she had underestimated just how prepared we were. My grandfather had been meticulous about the cabin's upkeep and legal standing. Every modification, no matter how small, had been properly permitted and documented. The septic system had passed inspection just 2 years ago. The dock was fully compliant with environmental guidelines, and even the fireplace had certification papers. All of it was neatly stored in a locked file cabinet in the cabin's small office, along with receipts, photos, and correspondence from county officials. Over the years, still, I knew that inspections, no matter how clean, could be disruptive and expensive. I also knew that county inspectors did not just show up on their own. They had to be triggered by complaints. And if there were complaints, there was a record of who filed them. That afternoon, I drove into town and visited the zoning department. The receptionist, a friendly woman in her 50s, listened as I explained that I had received a sudden notice. She tapped at her computer, glanced at the screen, and then gave me a knowing look. "I'm not supposed to give out details," she said quietly, "but let's just say the name attached to these complaints starts with a K and ends with an N, and it's not the first time she's done this to someone." I thanked her, filed the knowledge away, and left with a new sense of clarity. This was not just about us. Karen had been using county channels to target other property owners for years. But while most people likely paid the fines or gave in to the hassle to make her go away, we were not about to fold. When the county inspector arrived 2 days later, Emily and I were ready. We greeted him warmly, provided every document he needed, and walked him through the property in detail. He was a straightforward man with a practical approach, and it quickly became clear he was not finding anything amiss. At one point, as he checked the dock, he glanced at me and said, "You've got a model property here. Whoever filed those complaints wasted my time." I could hear the irritation in his voice, not at us, but at the false report. By the end of the inspection, he handed us a clean bill of compliance and even agreed to sign a statement confirming that the complaints were unfounded. It was a small victory, but an important one. We now had documented proof not only that the property was in perfect standing, but also that someone had filed a baseless complaint. That paper, I knew, would become a crucial piece in our next move. Emily, never one to let an opportunity slip, suggested we dig deeper. "If she's done this to us and others, there's a pattern," she said. "And patterns get attention when you present them to the right people." She was right. That night, we began reaching out to neighbors, not just within the HOA boundaries, but in the surrounding area. Slowly, stories began to emerge. One man told us how Karen had tried to have his shed removed, claiming it was a fire hazard, despite it being brand new. Another woman recounted a time Karen had called animal control on her because her dog barked once during the afternoon. The more we listened, the more it became clear that Karen's reach extended far beyond petty HOA disputes. She had made a Vede hobby of weaponizing rules, regulations, and local agencies against anyone she considered out of line with her vision of community standards. But here was where things got interesting. In talking to neighbors, we stumbled across something that could change everything. A man who lived 2 streets over mentioned that Karen had recently built an addition to her own home, a large sunroom that had gone up shockingly fast. "Funny thing is," he said, lowering his voice, "I don't think she pulled the permits for it." That was the moment the tide began to turn. We suddenly realized that the same tools Karen had used against others could be used to hold her accountable. If she had made an unpermitted change to her property, that was a violation, and not just an HOA 1, but a county-level issue. The next morning, Emily and I made a quiet trip to the county building department. We asked to see the public record of permits for Karen's address. The clerk flipped through the files, scanned the screen, and then looked up with a small frown. "There's no record of any addition or sunroom," she confirmed. "If that structure exists, it's not on file." We walked out of that office with more than just a copy of our compliance report. We had leverage. Karen had made her move, and now it was our turn to make one she would never forget. Turning the tables once we had confirmation that Karen's gleaming new sunroom had no record in the county permit files, the path forward became obvious. But as tempting as it was to march up to her front door and confront her with the evidence, that would have been too easy for her to twist into another narrative about us being aggressive or disruptive. No, if we were going to make this count, it had to be handled in a way that left no room for her to paint herself as the victim. The county needed to act, and they needed to see her for what she truly was, someone who weaponized rules against others while blatantly ignoring them herself. Emily and I began by compiling everything we had, the unfounded complaint she filed against our cabin, the clean compliance report from the inspector, statements from neighbors who had also been targeted, and now the lack of permits for her own property modification. The more we organized it, the more it felt like we were building a case, not just for our defense, but for the community's protection. Emily's military discipline came through in every detail. Every page was labeled. Every photo was dated, and every account was typed up with clarity and precision. Before taking it to the county, I decided to speak with a few more neighbors to ensure we weren't missing anything. That's when one of them, an older gentleman named Howard, mentioned something even more damning. "That sunroom she built," he said, "it's not just unpermitted, it's sitting right up against the property setback line." I told her about it when she started building, but she waved me off, said the HOA approved it, so it didn't matter. His words made me pause. The HOA might have given her a verbal blessing, but county codes overrode any association rules. If she had built within that restricted distance from the property line, she was in violation regardless of HOA approval. Armed with that new information, Emily and I went back to the county building department. We presented the folder to an inspector named Daniels, a no-nonsense man with a quiet authority about him. He listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing up from the documents to look at us with a raised brow. When we finished, he closed the folder and said, "If what you're saying is accurate, this isn't just a permit violation, it could be a zoning infraction. We take that seriously." He promised to look into it immediately, which in county terms could mean anything from a few days to a few weeks. But in this case, it only took 3 days. It was late morning when the white county inspection truck rolled slowly into the HOA neighborhood. Emily and I had been in town picking up supplies, but as fate would have it, we turned onto the main road just as the truck pulled up in front of Karen's pristine home. Even from a distance, we could see her on the porch wearing a wide sun hat and pruning flowers as though she had all the time in the world. When she spotted the truck, she straightened, her hands freezing mid-motion. Daniel stepped out, clipboard in hand, and walked up the path with a calm, deliberate pace, We didn't stop or interfere, we simply drove past at a slow, steady speed, giving a polite wave. Emily's eyes sparkled with quiet satisfaction as Karen stiffly returned the wave, her smile tight and unconvincing. It was a small but undeniable shift in power. This time, she was the one standing on her porch while an official approached with questions she couldn't brush aside. Over the next hour, Daniels inspected the sunroom from multiple angles, took measurements, and snapped photos. We later learned from a neighbor who lived across the street that Karen's expression shifted from guarded confidence to thinly veiled panic as he pointed to certain areas and jotted notes on his clipboard. She followed him around, gesturing animatedly, likely trying to justify her choices, but his body language never softened. That evening, Daniels called me directly. "Mr. Walker," he said, "I can't disclose all the details just yet, but I will tell you this. There are multiple violations here. No permits on file, structural concerns, and yes, the addition is encroaching on the property setback. She'll be receiving an official notice in the mail within the week, and she'll have to either remove or modify the structure to comply." His tone carried the faintest hint of satisfaction, the kind that comes from seeing someone who manipulates the system finally face consequences. When the notice arrived at Karen's home, it was as though the neighborhood's atmosphere shifted. People noticed her SUV staying parked in the driveway more often. Her daily patrols around the community all but stopped. For the first time since we'd known her, she seemed to be avoiding public interaction. Neighbors began whispering, with the fearful caution of before, but with a mix of curiosity and relief. The same woman who had policed their flower beds and mailbox colors was now fighting to keep her own home from being partially dismantled. Emily and I didn't gloat openly, though the temptation was there. Instead, we focused on maintaining our usual routine at the cabin, knowing full well that Karen's absence from our property line was the clearest sign that our message had landed. Yet, I also knew people like her rarely accepted defeat gracefully. If there was any way she could claw back control or save face, she'd take it. And judging by the restless way her curtains twitched whenever a car passed, she was already thinking about her next move. What she didn't realize was that we were not done either. Because while she was busy defending herself from the county's scrutiny, we were preparing to make sure her grip over the HOA itself was broken for good. The final blow, the week after Karen's official violation notice was delivered, the HOA announced a special leadership meeting. The notice posted on the community bulletin board said it would be held to address ongoing concerns regarding leadership conduct, community trust, and member satisfaction. The language was deliberately vague, but anyone who had been paying attention could read between the lines. The events of the past month had shaken the HOA to its core. For the first time in years, Karen's authority was being openly questioned, not just by frustrated residents, but by her fellow board members. Emily and I debated whether we should attend. On one hand, we were not members of the HOA and technically had no obligation to be there. On the other hand, we had become the spark that ignited this change, and we knew we still had one final role to play. Emily was the one who made the decision. For us. "If she's going down, I want to see it happen," she said with a quiet firmness. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in the HOA clubhouse, the same polished room where Karen had once tried to turn the community against us. This time, however, the atmosphere was different. Instead of polite, cautious murmurs, the air buzzed with anticipation. Residents gathered in small clusters, some holding printed copies of the county's violation notice, others flipping through HOA bylaws. I recognized several of the neighbors we had spoken to during our investigation, and when they saw us enter, they greeted us warmly, an unspoken acknowledgement that we were all part of the same cause now. Karen was already seated at the front table, but she was not alone. The HOA president sat beside her, along with two other board members who wore the tense expressions of people about to navigate a storm. Karen herself looked different. Her hair was neatly styled, her outfit immaculate as always, but the confident gleam in her eyes was gone. Instead, there was a guarded wariness, as though she knew the ground beneath her was no longer solid. The president opened the meeting with a short statement about transparency, fairness, and the importance of maintaining trust between leadership and the community. He then addressed the elephant in the room. Over the past month, he began, multiple incidents have come to light that raise questions about the way certain complaints and enforcement actions have been handled. These include the misuse of HOA authority, targeting of non-member properties, and the filing of unfounded reports with county agencies. A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. Karen sat rigidly, her jaw tight, but she said nothing. The president continued, "In addition, we have received confirmation from county inspectors that a recent addition to the home of a sitting board member, Mrs. Karen Thompson, was constructed without the necessary permits and in violation of zoning setbacks. This is a serious matter, as it undermines the integrity of our association when those in leadership disregard the very standards they expect others to follow." That was the moment the room shifted. People began speaking up, not timidly, but with the pent-up frustration of years. A man in the back stood and described how Karen had fined him 3 times for having his garbage cans visible for too long on pickup day. A woman near the front recounted how Karen had tried to dictate the color of her shutters, despite there being no rule about it. Another neighbor mentioned the way Karen had publicly embarrassed a family at a meeting for having too many guests at a backyard barbecue. The stories poured out, one after another, and each one chipped further away at the facade Karen had built. Finally, the president opened the floor for Karen to respond. She rose slowly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I have always acted in what I believe to be the best interest of this community," she began, her voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "Yes, mistakes may have been made, but everything I've done has been to maintain our standards and protect property values." It might have worked if she had stopped there. But then, perhaps out of habit, she let the old Karen slip through. "And as for these recent accusations," she said, glancing in our direction, "I believe they've been exaggerated by certain individuals who don't understand the responsibilities of leadership." That was Emily's cue. She stood, calm and composed, and walked to the front of the room. Without raising her voice, she placed the folder we had compiled onto the table. "These are county documents," she said evenly. "They include the violation notice for your unpermitted construction, the clean compliance report for our cabin, and written statements from your neighbors describing a consistent pattern of harassment. These aren't exaggerations, Karen. They're facts. And leadership is about serving people, not controlling them." The silence that followed was different from the stunned hush at the earlier meeting. This was a silence of collective realization. The president glanced at the other board members, then addressed the room. "Given the seriousness of these findings," he said, "I am calling for a motion to remove Mrs. Thompson from the board. Effective immediately." The vote was not close. Hands shot up across the room, and when the count was finished, it was unanimous. Karen was out. She gathered her papers with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact with anyone, and walked out of the clubhouse without a word. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the community changed noticeably. The HOA board began focusing on real issues instead of petty control. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down now felt free to plant the flowers they wanted, host gatherings without fear, and simply enjoy their homes. As for the cabin, it remained exactly as it had been: peaceful, private, and untouched by HOA interference. One evening, Emily and I sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the lake. The air was calm, the only sounds the gentle rustle of the pines and the distant call of a loon. Emily sipped her coffee and smiled. "Think she ever come back?" she asked. I shook my head. Not as the person she was. People like her thrive on power, and once it's gone. I let the sentence trail off. We both knew the answer. For us, the real victory wasn't just in winning against Karen. It was in knowing that the truth, when backed by patience and persistence, could dismantle even the most entrenched arrogance. And as the last light faded from the horizon, I realized something my grandfather must have known when he built this cabin. Some places aren't just property, they're sanctuary. And a sanctuary is worth defending, no matter how long the fight.